Hello everyone, my name is Sabrina Khairunnisa. So today I would like to explain the materials about the 20th century that served from 1945 until 2000. So these are the materials that I will explain. First, introduction. Second, the characteristics. Third, the literature. And fourth is the famous author. The first materials is about the brief introduction of 20th century. The United States of America, which had entered the First World War in 1916 and entered the Second World War in late 1941. The years since the end of the Second World War have seen a decline in British influence and continued failure to compete successfully with the newly developing economies of the world. The ending of the Second World War didn't bring with it stability. In national terms, the country has also seen decentralization. The regions have competed with London for economic, social, and cultural influence. The next material is about the characteristics of this era. There are some characteristics of 20th century. First, it's about the society. In social terms, a long period of austerity led to the boom years of the 1960s, when the post-war youth culture began to find expression, and a new affluence and optimism filled Britain. After the Second World War, the change in society, in ways of thought and in literature, were every bit as deep and far-reaching as they were after the First World War. Each decade in the second half of the 20th century had a distinct and different feeling. The 1950 was the age of austerity, the 1960 the age of youth, the 1970 an age of anxiety, the 1980 an age of new materialism, and the 1990 an age of recession and preoccupation. And about the economic in this century, in the early decades of the 20th century, the American people benefit from industrial growth, while also experiencing its at first effect. Cheap labor and assembly line manufacturing made mass production possible. Railroad networks carry the mass-produced goods, many of them the result of new technologies, around the country. Materially, city-dwellers' standards of living improved steadily, not only in food, shelter, housing, and other material goods, but also in health care and education. And about the media in this century, in spite of the growth of other media, more books are now being published than ever before, and more books are being read than ever before. And about the literature in this era, the mix of post-Darwin and postmodern is indicative of the binary linking of traditional and new elements in literature. The subject matter is still essentially the human condition, but the means and methods of exploring it are infinitely richer and more varied than ever before. It is almost impossible to classify modern authors in terms of their lasting contribution to the literature of their time. For the novelist A.S. Byatt, there is throughout this time a new richness and diversity in English writing, a continuing of the search for a post-Darwinian security and creativity, a wonderful mix of realism, romance, fable, satire, parody, play with form, and philosophical. And the last is about the art and architecture. The modern art movement revolutionized art and culture and set the stage for both modernism and its counterpart postmodern art as well as other contemporary art practices. Art Nouveau began as a French architecture and design but fell out of fashion after World War I. The style was dynamic and inventive but ensued to the depression of the Great War. In Europe, modern architecture departed from the decorated style of the Victorian era. Streamlined forms inspired by machine become commonplace, enabled by development in building, materials, and technologies. Before World War II, many European architects moved to the United States, where modern architecture continued to develop. The next materials is about the characteristic of literature in the 20th century. First is about the drama. The theater was dominated until the 1950 by well-made plays in standard English for middle-class audience. In the 1950s, the language used in the theater was deliberately elevated in keeping with the elevated social position of the majority of characters. Theater has expanded enormously since the 1950s. There are alternative theaters and groups of every kind, and the monolithic presence of the major dramatists has given way to creative enterprise on many levels. Local theaters, community theater, children's theater all flourish with little regard for the more traditional West End London theater scene. A great deal of drama is produced on television and radio, and most dramatists have at some time worked in this media and in the cinema. And about the novel, the decades following the Second World War have seen a considerable increase in the numbers of novels published and in the variety of themes and subjects they cover. Among the voices which can be more clearly heard in the novel in recent years are those of the young and the lower classes, the voice of the new educated middle class, the voice of women, racial minorities, gays, and outsiders of many other types. Various subgenres of novel have become bestsellers while retaining intellectual accessibility. For example, the working class novel, the Hampstead novel, the academic novel, the Scottish novel, the woman's novel, and the magic realist novel. At the same time, there have been numerous bestsellers which have never reached intellectual acceptability. For example, romance, thrillers, and historical novels. Some genres, like the detective story and the spy story, have, however, begun to receive critical acclaim and to be recognized as major contribution to literature. And about the poetry, the years after 1945 saw both continuity and change in English poetry. Some poets, despite modernism, continue romantic tradition. Writing surface in the Second World War was different. Like the poet of the First World War, they were participants and observers rather than critics or commentators. Other parts are not as clearly in the Romantic tradition. And the focus of poetry in this era is restricted, concentrating more on the particulars of everyday life. And about the writers, modernist writers generally prefer titles which are oblique and symbolic and which require an ache of interpretation from the reader. They don't always provide the reader with any definite anchor in recognizably realistic people and place. For example, Ulysses, The Rainbow, and Heart of the Darkness. And about the children's literature, and there has been a considerable boom in writing for younger readers since Victorian writers first wrote for that specific readership. Originally, these tales were often highly moral, instructional books, school stories, and adventure tales. In the early 20th century, a vein of whimsy became popular with such writers as A. Milne, achieving classic status with Winnie the Pooh and The House at Pooh Corner. And there is also Enid Blyton become one of the most popular children's writer of the century with two different kinds of story. For very young readers, there were tales featuring Noddy and his friend Big Ears in Toyland. And for their older brother and sister, there were middle-class adventure story featuring the famous Five and later the Sacred Seven. The novel of J.R.R. Tolkien created a fictional world that encompasses mythology, fable, and fantasy and reached a huge worldwide readership. And at the end of the 20th century, J.K. Rowling became a worldwide best-selling phenomenon with her series of books featuring the schoolboy wizard Harry Potter. Uh, it is combined elements of Tolkien, the fairy tale genre, and school novel into a hugely enjoyable mixture which brings a love for storytelling to readers from the age of 8 to over 80. And the last materials is about the famous authors in this era. There are some famous authors. First, J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien was a philologist and professor of medieval language and literature, and his fiction contained many influences from the period. His hero, Bilbo Baggins, is a hobbit whose adventures take him through a range of landscape and encounters with heroes and villains in a modern epic the form of a series of novels like The Hobbit, the three volumes of The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion. The next author is George Orwell. George Orwell had come to prominence in the 1930s, commenting intensely on the social and political world of his day in such non-fiction work as Burmese Days and Dawn and Out in Paris and London. Orwell is probably best known throughout the world as a political satirist. His Algeria novel, Animal Farm, having been translated into over 40 languages. So that's all from my explanation. Sorry if I have a mistake when I explain the materials, and thank you for watching my videos and have a nice day.